Before we get started, there's a little bit of vocab that I really want to discuss and define, because I'd like us to have a shared schema. First, disability. So this sign both means disability and disabled. Now, I understand that most deaf people don't consider themselves as disabled or as having a disability. It's this feeling of, I was born deaf, I don't have a disability. I understand that. But for this specific usage, we're following what the ADA law says qualifies someone as someone with a disability. There's a few parts, but I'm going to focus on two. The first one is someone with a disability, and that really impacts their everyday life and makes it challenging and harder. The other one is someone who another person perceives as having a disability, and that perception means it impacts everyday life activities and makes them harder. So that's the usage for this discussion, because the focus is on changing the general special ed system and also how that impacts different groups. Special education. That tends to be related with IEPs or services for students, but it also can mean someone who has a qualifying disability and how we help them. They'll need support or accommodations. For example, someone who's blind and is learning to navigate the hallway, they need to work with the orientation and mobility specialist. Another example would be needing to figure out how to self-advocate if you know that you're going to become overwhelmed because you have autism or you're autistic. So that's special education. Inclusion means students with disabilities spend most of the time with their age group peers in a class. For example, a student in a wheelchair who wants to go on the class field trip can, because the bus has to be accessible. It means they can stay with their friends. Mainstream. This means general education for typical schools, private or public. It means students with disabilities tend to be interacting with their classmates. It's not a special school, it's not a special program, but it means that you're interacting with everyone. But you will see deaf people who tend to sign it like this. The reason this happens is because, yes, the idea of integration is about interacting with your peers in an accessible way, but if you're the only deaf student, you can feel really isolated, and then it feels like you're being forced to conform. Institutionalization. I'm going to use this sign. It means taking students who have been identified as having a qualifying disability and putting them into a school where they live. I won't use the sign institution here because that tends to mean deaf schools. And there are positive memories and beliefs about students who attended those. Warehousing. It means institutionalizing a student and then basically ignoring them. It tends to mean noticing that a student has a qualifying disability and putting them in a special program, but not really providing any education. Yes, it's a special school, and yes, it's a special program, but they're basically left alone. Oral, and LSL. I tend to sign it just LSL or oral, because the focus is on listening skills. Students tend to be hard of hearing who are using this and either use hearing aids or a BAHA or an implant or closed captioning or speech reading. The focus is on integrating with the hearing world. Now, there's no focus on deaf culture, and most of these students don't sign. I understand that the deaf community has opinions about this, but for this discussion, we really mean an approach that the student is using that's been given to them because their parents chose it for them. There's 3: deaf, DHH, and hearing loss. Okay. Deaf. Big capital deaf with a D. Yeah. Deaf community, deaf culture, the student signs or the family signs. DHH is a neutral term that means a student who is deaf or hard of hearing, and it means they've experienced going to the audiologist and having them say, your hearing level isn't typical. That's it. Hearing loss. That one's a bit of a challenge because if you're born deaf, I didn't lose my hearing. I was born deaf. I didn't lose anything. And I understand that. But again, for this discussion, it means if your hearing levels aren't typical. If we're talking about, your kind of hearing loss, it tends to mean what was it specifically that caused your deafness? If we're talking about your hearing levels or your hearing loss levels, it means how much sound access do you have? General education. For this, it means a school that is not focused on providing access to students with disabilities. It's generally classroom teachers. Public, private, doesn't matter. But if we're talking about teachers of the deaf, we'll use TODs. If we're talking about other kinds of specialists or special ed teachers, we'll talk about their specific speciality. Two different kinds of LRE. This one was set up with the law that passed in 1965 and then clarified with the law that happened in 1975. This means Least Restrictive Environment. It was set up because students who were institutionalized or who were warehoused, people noticed that they didn't have any opportunities. Some of them had no education, and that needed to improve. So they required the schools to become more accessible. That was the goal. The meaning is that students are supposed to have as much time as possible with their non-disabled peers. Okay. This is called a language-rich environment. This is the deaf perspective. It means students who sign, because it's a fully accessible language, they need to be able to interact with adults, with teachers, with peers, with staff who sign. This was definitely a response to the original LRE because it was good for students who were able to fully interact in a mainstream setting, but for deaf students, it often meant isolation, and that wasn't a good fit. So because teachers and educators are required to look at LRE, people decided to use the same letters to explain the differences and how it's different for deaf students. Special education currently is not perfect in any way, but before 1965, it was awful. Many students had no education. They had no services, no real supports. If a student was identified as having a disability, they would be institutionalized and then just left and warehoused. Yes, they had food. Yes, they had clothes. Yes, they had a roof over their head, but that tended to be it. There was no support, there was no teaching, there was no goal setting. And it really more was about, oh, this student is a lot of hard work, so we're just going to kind of leave them there and take care of them and keep them alive, but that's it. Until that law passed in '65, many students with disabilities had no educational access. Yes, they were put into these programs, but that was it. And only about 1/5 of students with a disability were having an education. 1/5. But in the deaf world, it was a little different. Deaf schools, usually run by the state, had already been set up, and that meant that students who went into them, if they were born deaf or if they'd been identified, especially if they were identified early, were put into these schools. And yes, it was an institution, but it meant the teachers signed. The staff signed. The other children signed. Yes, some students lived there during the week and then would go back home for the weekends, sure, and they'd eat there and they'd sleep there. But it meant that they had complete access and full opportunities to receive their education. For deaf students who grew up in a deaf school, they tend to have a lot of positive associations and memories. But for other students with disabilities, it wasn't like that. It meant that there were no chances to really get outside and succeed. There was really no chance to get outside and live on their own. The first law that really changed how education worked for children who were disabled was the Elementary and Secondary, middle and high school, Education Act. It passed in 1965. It didn't really go deeply into changing anything, but there were two big things that happened. The first one is the federal government started providing grants, and those became available for school districts through the states. That meant that the feds were helping to gift money and pay for students with disabilities to have access to some sort of education. Secondly, who's responsible for disabled students' education? In the past, it was sort of not really taken a look at. It was like, yeah, these students don't really fit. Some states would just bar students with specific disabilities, deaf, blind, whatever, from going to school at all. With the passage of this law, it meant that the school districts themselves became responsible for providing students with disabilities an education. Because, the feds were paying for it, right? The second big change that impacted children with disabilities education, it passed in 1975, and it's called the EAH, the Education for All Handicapped Children. The law was signed by President Ford, and yes, I want to address the fact that handicapped is not a word that we use now. It has changed over time, but back then, that was the appropriate vocabulary. All right. So this offered many things that really had an impact, but we're going to go over a few. First, it introduced FAPE. That we're going to explain in just a second in this next slide. But that offered, for the first time, meant that students had a right to an education, disabled or not. They knew that they should have it. It also created IEPs. That is important. We'll discuss that soon too. It also introduced the concept of related services, meaning, like, for example, if you have a student who has had surgery, right? And yes, they have accommodations that they need. They have some disabilities that are going on with that. And you're also providing them maybe with a connection with a speech therapist if there's been an injury or whatever. Also with deaf and hard of hearing students, it'll mean access to an audiologist. At least it does for us a lot. Or it means speech therapy if they want, or it can mean access to fixing of their hearing devices or captioning or other services. Disabled students now had some protections as well. It meant, hey, you told me that I couldn't come here and you wanted to put me in an institution. I couldn't go into the mainstream. That's what I want. You can't tell me that I can't come in because I'm using a wheelchair. That's not fair and it's not right, and now it's illegal. And fifth, it gave parents some rights so that they could decide to be involved in meetings about their child's placement, where they want to go to school, what programs that'll look like. It means that they could be in the discussion, they could get involved, and could ask questions. Before that, there wasn't really a chance to say, yeah, I don't like that. Well, we didn't ask you, was sort of the response parents got. Their opinions didn't matter. And the professionals just kind of... So, FAPE, FAPE. It stands for Free and Appropriate Public Education. Simple, right? Easy. That means that all students have the right to what? To access the school. They can't be charged for it. It can't be, oh, I'm sorry, your disability is going to cost this district money, so you're going to have to pay for it. It also means that public education, if they're going to a mainstream program, they have to have it be accessible, or it means that they will have accommodations and supports and related services that makes it accessible for them, the same as anybody receiving any other kind of education, right? For students who are deaf and hard of hearing, that becomes a bit of an argument because free, sure, everyone can agree on that. But what's appropriate mean? Does that mean sitting in a classroom, watching the teacher talk, trying to speech read, or trying to watch the interpreter and figure out how to do that? Does that mean being in a mainstream class with an interpreter and watching, but where are you learning the language? Does that mean being all by yourself with no chance to work with other deaf people? Does that mean being all by yourself and not having a chance to communicate with any peers? That all kind of depends. So FAPE, yes, that's what the states and the school districts and the teachers and the deaf special educators and everybody is supposed to provide in the giant meetings that we have to talk about it with the team, with the parents, to figure out what is the appropriate IEPs. Most of us have run into that word, but what does it mean? It is an individualized education plan. And it really has basically two parts. The first one is accommodations. And the second one is specially designed instruction. So accommodations are supports and services. As an example, for a deaf and hard of hearing student, it can mean using an FM or a hearing amplification technology system so that they can listen more easily. It can mean using an interpreter. It can mean using captions. It can mean the student knows that part of their homework includes watching the teacher and taking notes at the same time, but because they're having to watch both the interpreter or watch the teacher in speech read, they can't take notes at the same time. So that means that that homework isn't required, and also that the student is provided the notes that they would have. But specially designed instruction is a little different instruction. That means that a specialist or a teacher or whomever comes in and works with the student one-on-one and gives them information. Sometimes they do go into the classroom and help out, but often they will pull the student from class. For example, a student who's autistic. They may have the supports and accommodations that they need, like breaks that are set up, but if the teacher working with them is like, oh, I've noticed that when you're trying to figure out how to get your homework done, you need to figure out how to make that planning work. Or if it feels like you're going to have a meltdown, you're trying to figure out how to recognize it ahead of time and don't want that to happen. So how to ask and self-advocate for the accommodations that you've already been provided. How do you ask the teacher for a break? For deaf and hard of hearing students, that self-advocacy piece works in too. If part of the work is how to use your technology, or how to use an interpreter, or how to request an interpreter, or how to get involved in all kinds of those pieces of teaching, and figuring out the best way to explain, why you have an interpreter, or why you're using hearing aids, or whatever. Those sorts of things impact your education, and so you need to figure out. So how do we decide if a deaf or hard of hearing student qualifies? First, at least in my state, they must have a specific level of hearing loss. Two different kinds. One, if we're talking about a unilateral loss, where only one ear is impacted, that ear has to have a 25 decibel loss, and it has to cross multiple frequencies. For a bilateral loss, it must again be a 25 decibel loss, and it has to cross a few frequencies. Perfect, fine, easy. There's different kinds of losses and different approaches, but sure. Does that mean that the student qualifies? Well, maybe. It depends. We have some students who have a mild loss. They're hard of hearing. They talk. That's fine. They've really decided to grow up and use hearing aids or an implant or a BAHA, and they function in the hearing world. So maybe for a few years they had an IEP and they learned some self-advocacy skills, how to fix their hearing aids themselves, how to ask for assignment help, whatever, sure. And now they have the technology, they have accommodations that they need, and they don't need the IEP anymore. So now there's no educational impact. So no IEP. One good example. Let's look at me. This is my audiogram, okay? All right, so my hearing loss, yeah, it starts out mild, and then all of my low frequencies are pretty much gone. So at work or my job, it's fine because most of the people are women. And when I don't have the hearing aids on, it's terrible, but yeah, I can do it. That's fine. With my son and my husband at home, it means I miss everything that they're saying unless they're looking right at me. And I did grow up hearing. So when my hearing loss happened, I was in my early 30s. And for me, it meant that if I was in school, high school, maybe, whatever, I probably wouldn't qualify for an IEP because the instruction I'm not going to specifically have a problem with, and it's not going to have to change. There's no specially designed instruction I would need. But the test that we use to check on students, what are you missing? If we've seen that you're getting home really tired, or if you're missing some sounds completely and altogether. We also do assessments for vocabulary and for processing memory and for other things to figure out what kinds of things does this student need. And if we're talking about a student who speaks English, is oral, fine. Okay, with an LSL student, you can check and you can see, all right, so how are you reading? What does your vocab look like? What is your reading level at? and we assess that way. If they're a signing student, it's a little bit different. We do some assessments for their sign skills and see how that's progressing and if they're at the right level for their grade. But also we see if they can figure out how to work with information that's presented. Because please understand, levels can be very different. If a student is in a deaf school, it means that we don't need to adjust their curriculum and add an interpreter because everything is in sign. Their teacher signs. It doesn't mean that they're depending on their hearing because everything is in sign. Maybe it's not really specially designed instruction, but the whole school is specially designed instruction. So it's a little bit more complicated. My preferred kind of test with students is to work on vocabulary, the English and the sign, and to see whether they can make up stories and whether they can figure out what the process is for laying things out. An example is a teacher who's like, okay, now we're getting ready for math. English portion of the day is over. So what does that mean? So the class, all the hearing kids, oh yeah, that means I close the math book and I put it away, and it means I bring out the other book and a pencil instead of a pen, right? But if the DHA student has been following, or if they don't understand through the interpreter, or if they're trying to watch both or watch the captions, it can be more of a challenge. So then again, you need specially designed instruction for helping to figure out those sorts of skills. So it depends all over. So I need to add one little comment here about the first law that introduced the idea and the concept of FAPE. So that was the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. Yep, 1973, which is 2 years before the Education Act passed. But the Rehab Act wasn't really about education. There's some parts that really have an impact on educational function, but it was more about public spaces and helping those become more accessible, which meant if you go to a store and you see that there's a building and there's a wheelchair ramp up to the front so that someone can skip the stairs, or if you see that there's a building that has stairs and they've added an elevator, or those sorts of things. If you go into a building and you go into the elevator, you can see or you can feel the braille, right? That's the kind of thing that this is for. If the federal government is subsidizing the building, then it needs to become more accessible. That's why if you go to a government building, you can request an interpreter. So that law has a lot going on in it, but the part that really has an impact on education is Section 504. That means that students who are in a public school or in a private school that receives government funds have a right to accommodations. Not necessarily to specially designed instruction, but schools must provide accommodations, which means if a student needs to arrive late, that's fine. If they need to sit in the front, that's fine. If they need to be able to stand for whatever reason, that's totally fine. Those sorts of things. It's interesting because kids who are deemed successful, deaf, hard of hearing, blind, whichever, some of them don't qualify for an IEP. Yes, they have a disability, but there's not considered an educational impact, which means that the school districts provide accommodations through a 504 plan. But the Rehab Act itself happened because of, yes, there's an impact on K-12 education. There really is. But the law happened because people who were sent off to the Vietnam War came back, and they had disabilities that they had acquired. And so when they tried to go to public universities or to get jobs or to get services or benefits, it meant that they needed access and accommodations. All right. So this law passed in 1975, And the name has changed over the years. And now it's called IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Fine, so that's the name we're going to use from now on. But the law has a goal for LRE. What is that goal? Why do we need to force students to interact in the mainstream schools? No, that's not the point. The point is that most people with disabilities, their experience over the years had been being institutionalized in warehouse. Be with other kids that have a disability like you. But like kids who have a wheelchair, kids who use feeding tubes, kids who have all these other things. It was just, they didn't get to spend any time with the kids in their neighborhood or in their area from their local schools. And that meant it really kind of limited their lives. Because if they're going home and they're going to see their kids nearby and they're going to have a birthday party, are they going to show up and join it? They don't know them. The kids from home don't know the student with a disability because they're basically barred from attending the school. And this meant that the first time the school was required to allow access for these students. And yes, it would mean some changes, like adaptive PE classes or whatever, so that the student in a wheelchair can play wheelchair basketball, right? Or whatever the adaptations are. But it means that they can go to an English class and to a math class and to whichever with their students. And most of the time, it was that there wasn't a disability class. It meant that you couldn't stick the students in there and decide that they couldn't be in there, that it was going to cost more money, and so we didn't want to deal with it. There was no one with training, no. So that in of itself isn't a problem, because most students with disabilities who'd been labeled that way didn't have a language restriction. Yes, there were some students who had trouble speaking, or some students who struggled with communication, sure, but it wasn't about a shared language with their neighborhood peers. It wasn't that conflict. And that can happen for LRE and for LRE. So with so many students being mainstreamed, it means that a lot of these institutions have been shut down because they're not needed, right? Because these students are going to their home schools in their neighborhood, which for most students is a real benefit. One thing that's concerning, though, is the word that's used is normalization. And it's supposed to mean that people with a disability, students in particular here, have a chance to set up the same kind of routines and have as close to the same sort of experience as people without disabilities. But many people feel like their disability isn't a problem and they're not struggling with it. The goal shouldn't be to force them to become, quote, normal, whatever that means. So that word also shows up when we're talking about teaching theories like in Montessori. And their word for it, their explanation, means that when children have figured out how to individuate, how to do things that they need to do, how to do creative thinking. Things like they've been following and learning and seeing what other people are doing. Oh, that's how you hold a pen to draw. That's how you write. And figuring out how to fit into that. And the fitting in piece isn't supposed to be a bad thing, but it doesn't necessarily mean that all of these people have groups that don't fit or that fitting in is. So with all of these residential schools being shut down, what did that mean for deaf schools? Well, yeah, they were also getting shut down. And there's a few reasons it happened. So first, there were a lot of children born between 1945 and 1955. Because World War II had ended and there were babies everywhere. And with more babies being born, then there were more deaf babies being born during the baby boom. So the population just drastically expanded. Then, in the 1960s, there was a big measles outbreak. And measles has two kinds of impacts. One, if mom is pregnant and gets sick, then the baby can be born deaf. But if you have a young child who's caught the measles, they can also often become deaf, which means the deaf population expanded even further. But the states who ran the deaf schools sort of were looking at that population growth and realized this is related to the baby boom and the measles outbreak. The population growth isn't going to continue to expand. So why are we going to invest into the deaf schools and build new buildings for that? It just seems like an awful lot of work. So they were figuring out how to do more of that inclusive mainstreaming approach. Since this happened right about the time of the 1975 Education Act, we had people who were very invested in the inclusion of students, making sure they weren't separated and isolated from their peers, which meant that more and more and more deaf students from the 60s to 75 were mainstreamed. Before 1975, from 1950, the deaf school population had shrunk to half, and it's continuing to shrink, in large part because of the mainstreaming tendency. Using an interpreter or using technology or whatever is the approach now. So deaf schools, self-inclusive classrooms, meaning like they're in a mainstream school, but the class itself is for deaf and hard of hearing students. Day school programs and itinerant teachers of the deaf working with students are what happens most often, where we show up and we work with students how to use an interpreter or maybe how to use their equipment. But that is the largest and most common way of working with deaf students right now. And we see them like once a week, which isn't a lot. So another problem that impacts deaf students is that many deaf and hard of hearing students suffer from other people's low expectations. And that happens for many reasons. Different laws, different goals, different curricula, which means that like inclusive schools like mainstream programs, but also it happens with testing. And they're trying to figure out from, okay, how do we set this up so that we can filter this to make the schools better and set up better planning and lessons. But for things like No Child Left Behind, schools were punished if the students didn't succeed on some of these tests. So for deaf students who are trying to go back and forth between sign and their peers and interaction, that can be more difficult, and it's a struggle. But because most parents see, oh, okay, I have a student going to a neighborhood school, they're mainstreamed, they can spend time with their peers. Yes, their hearing loss is continuing to grow, but I mean, they talk, they listen, they use their implant. This will be fine from here on out. If students are struggling with trying to connect sign with reading, who's doing something about that? Parents tend to be surprised because parents don't sign. That's a really big problem itself. And it has an impact on reading level because students who are deaf or hard of hearing, now let's back up. You can see people say that the average deaf student graduates with a 4th grade reading level. It's a really common statistic. And that's not exactly true. So the test that they're basing this on, they're just using this one test. It's not a bunch of different data. It's not across the spectrum of reading level, but it's this one test. And deaf students are shown on this. So the average, it's the middle. So the 50% of deaf students graduate below a 4th grade reading level, and 50% are above. All right. So then what's the problem? Well, the problem is that mainstream schools don't have anything that is specifically set up for deaf and hard of hearing students. Yes, some have access through interpreters, but if you're teaching a song to help you memorize the state capitals or the names of the states, or you're doing poetry where you need to recognize rhyme, that isn't accessible to deaf students. They won't understand the context for it with their learning style. So if they're mainstreamed, they can miss things that they would learn at the deaf school. It also means that kids don't catch up appropriately. So LRE, language-rich environment. What does that actually mean? So that term was used by people in response to the original LRE. That's important, yes, but it isn't connected with other deaf and hard of hearing students and how they pick up culture and how they pick up language. Students are picking this up when they're with other deaf people, which means really if they're mainstreamed and forced into it, they're missing out. They're not really being provided with the same kind of access as their disabled peers. They don't have teachers that share a language. They don't have lights for emergencies that necessarily show what the responses are. It's inclusive. They're with other children, but it's not with other deaf people. If they're at a deaf school and the fire alarm happens, the light will go off. But an earthquake drill will be a different kind of light pattern because you know that the students are going to have to figure out which one you need. At a mainstream school, many have different sounds for the alarms, but the lights aren't different. That sort of thing, or another example, students who need to do the quiet and hide drill for safety reasons. If you have a student who's deaf and they're in a hallway and the alarm goes off and the door shuts and locks, they come up and they can't get back in. But if that student meets someone in the hallway, they can't communicate with that adult because they can't explain why you're outside, why we can't let you in. They can't explain where they're supposed to be or why they're having to hide. There's a lot of conflicts that happen with that. So if the student is looking for their parents maybe don't sign, but if they're interacting with other deaf people in an educational environment, then they get that full understanding of signed play and signing with reading and signing with sports and math and science, and all of it is in sign. That's the same kind of experience that the hearing students have because everything is spoken. So they have spoken sports, for example. So you want them to have a similar experience. It doesn't have to be the same. You want it to be equitable, the same kind of level of experience. That's why deaf education tends to prefer not forced mainstreaming and inclusion, but what is best to force people to see what the best supports are for the student. Progress is definitely being made, and we hope to see bigger changes happen, yes. But remember, for quite a few years in the last century and the one before, people were very adamantly against sign. It was supposed to be an oral-only environment. And so now there are deaf lawyers and there are deaf doctors and there are deaf nurses and all kinds of professions. So it's improved, but also now the federal guidelines say that for figuring out where a student needs to be placed, there are all these rules and requirements for how much time they're separated from their non-disabled peers, for example, and how much time they're out of the classroom. But for deaf students specifically, it now says that you must include analysis of their linguistic and cultural needs. That's really important because it means that, yes, like full-time with an interpreter in a classroom, maybe that works. But it might be that the deaf school is where the student belongs. And that's an improvement for them to pick up the language and the culture that they need. That has been a really long effort by deaf advocates and protesters, and it's required a lot of work to make sure that we could change the perspective on what that looks like, and improvement's been made. For me, for example, our state only recently started to encourage us to, in a placement meeting, be like, oh, okay, yeah, the placement options you've got. There is this school that is mainstreamed and there's an interpreter and it's close to the area, or there's captioning, or whichever, there's a teacher of the deaf that visits. But have you considered the Oregon School for the Deaf? That school is maybe your son or your daughter's best fit. We can't force parents to make any decision, but we can drop in our feedback now, which is nice. It also means that we can encourage students to pick up sign, especially those who have grown up speaking an oral, and then their hearing has continued to deteriorate, or it's progressive loss, which means, okay, so now it's harder for me. What am I supposed to do? Well, you've got options. You know your son and daughter, for example, speaks already. It's not like they're going to give that up, but now they're going to have to pick up sign, which means that later, when they're completely deaf,